On a cold evening in the city, a young girl whispered across a restaurant table, "Can I have the leftovers?" Her voice trembled, her eyes pleading, yet full of quiet dignity. No one noticed except one man. Arthur, a successful businessman, felt a jolt of something he hadn't felt in years, the urge to protect her. That single moment would change both their lives forever. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I still remember the night I heard a voice so small it barely carried across the noise of silver spoons and wine glasses. A night of celebration, of laughter spilling from men who had never once tasted hunger, of perfumes heavy enough to drown out the scent of roasted lamb. It was the kind of room where wealth thought itself immortal. I sat there among them, my glass half raised, my smile half false, waiting for the evening to pass. And then that voice came. "Can I clean for leftover food?" she asked. 5 words, no more, and yet they shattered something inside me so completely that I can still hear them. Even now, all these years later, I turned my head and I saw her. She was small, no taller than the table itself, with hair tied back in a messy knot, strands falling loose like shadows across her face. Her dress was frayed, thin against the winter night that pressed itself against the glass windows of that grand hall. She did not look at me. She looked at the plates, at the crumbs left behind by men who spoke of markets and contracts, as though they were gods deciding the fate of nations. Her eyes did not plead. They measured, calculated. How much bread could be scraped from that crust? How much broth from a spoon not yet licked clean? There was no shame in her voice, only desperation polished smooth by repetition. This was not the first table she had approached. The laughter around me faltered. A few men smirked, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them muttered, "Another beggar child," as if the sight of her was a nuisance, a crack in their painted world. The waiter stepped forward, reaching for her arm as though to drag her back out into the cold. And God forgive me, I did not move. I watched. I let them send her away. My glass remained in my hand. My smile remained on my lips. My heart, though, clenched in a way I could not name. When she turned her face just for a moment, her eyes met mine. They were not wide and innocent like a child's should have been. They were hollowed by something far crueler, a secret, a weight she carried alone. And though she said nothing, I felt the question burning in them. Would you let me starve too? That moment ended quickly. The waiter pushed her toward the door, and the noise of the restaurant swelled again to cover the silence she left behind. The music resumed, laughter returned, and the silver spoons clinked as though nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. I tried to laugh with them, to drink, to nod when they raised toast to their own cleverness. Yet all I could see was her fragile figure pressed against the glass as the waiter shoved her outside. I imagined her breath fogging the window, her fingers leaving faint smudges as she steadied herself, the darkness waiting for her with the patience of a predator. I should have gone after her then. I should have left the table, ignored the curious stares, and followed her into the night. But I didn't. I sat there cowardly in my silence, and by the time I stepped out, she was gone. For weeks I told myself it had been nothing, just a child. One of many, a ghost that slipped through the cracks of a city too proud to admit its broken pieces. Yet her voice stayed with me, whispering into my sleep, rising above the clatter of dreams. "Can I clean for leftover food?" It was not a plea. It was a contract. She was offering her hands, her labor, her dignity, for scraps. And we, the so-called kings of industry, could not even give her that dot. I began to notice things I had never seen before. The children lingering near alleyways, the shadows that moved quickly at the sight of police, the bruises half hidden under sleeves too short for the season. I saw them now because of her. She had peeled something open in me, something I had buried long ago, under contracts and numbers and victories carved into balance sheets. but nothing struck me harder than the night I saw her again. It was weeks later, after another long evening of pointless dinners. I had chosen a quieter route home, through streets where the lamps flickered weakly and the air smelled of smoke. I heard a noise soft, like fabric tearing, and turned a corner to find her. She was kneeling on the ground, clutching a sack of bread she had scavenged from somewhere, her body hunched as though protecting treasure. A man towered over her, his voice harsh, his hand raised as if the world owed him the right to strike. I froze. For one sickening moment, I considered turning away, telling myself it was not my business. That is what men like me do best. But then her eyes lifted again. They found me in the half-light. And this time, I saw not only hunger, but fear. Not the kind of fear that passes quickly, but the kind that takes root in the soul and grows there. Twisting every thought, I stepped forward before I even knew I had moved. The man turned, his scowl breaking into something weaker when he saw me, saw the cut of my coat, the weight of authority stitched into every line of it. He spat to the side, muttered, and disappeared into the dark. She remained crouched, clutching her sack, her small chest rising and falling as though the night itself had been pressing down on her. I knelt. Slowly, carefully. "What's your name?" I asked. She hesitated. Then, softly, almost inaudibly, she whispered, "Maya." It was the first time I heard her name. And though I did not know it then, it would be the name that would haunt me, the name that would become both a wound and a salvation. She did not thank me. She did not smile. She only stood, clutching her bread, and walked away without looking back. But I followed her with my eyes until she disappeared into the crooked alleys, where even the streetlights dared not shine. I thought of following her, but something in me, fear, pride, shame held me back. I told myself I would see her again, that the city was not so vast as to swallow her completely. But what I did not know that night, what I could not have known, was that saving her once would mean risking everything again. That she carried secrets darker than her hollow eyes revealed, and that those secrets would one day drag me into a storm I could never escape, because the truth was simple. That child had not asked me for charity. She had asked me for a chance. And in the cruel arithmetic of this world, chances are often bought with blood. I was not born into the kind of room where laughter spilled over crystal glasses, or where lamb was carved into neat slices on porcelain plates. No chandeliers swung. Above me, no golden cutlery shimmered under candlelight. My beginning was smaller, rougher, carved out of scarcity and the sharp edges of survival. Hunger was not an occasional guest in our home, it was family. It lived with us, sat beside us at the table, and gnawed at our bones when the bread ran out. My earliest memory is of a pot rattling on a stove. Water boiling, but nothing inside it except a handful of potatoes that had grown soft and gray. My mother stood over it, wooden spoon in hand, stirring slowly as if her movement alone might summon flavor. I remember asking her, "Is this dinner?" She smiled at me with tired eyes, brushing hair from her face. "Yes, love. Tonight, it's soup," but I could see the truth in her hands. They shook from exhaustion, from worry, from the knowledge that the meal would not fill us. We lived in a one-room flat at the edge of the city, walls peeling from damp, floorboards creaking under every step. My father had left when I was 2, young to know his face, and my mother carried the burden of keeping us alive. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, worked double shifts at a laundry where the air reeked of steam and bleach. And yet, despite all that, the coins she brought home clinked with a hollowness that echoed in our stomachs. Hunger teaches you things no school ever can. It teaches you to chew slowly, to stretch every bite into a moment. It teaches you to notice the smallest details, a crust of bread left behind on a neighbor's windowsill, the faint scent of roasted meat drifting through alleyways, the way your stomach curls in on itself when there is nothing left to give. But it also teaches you shame. I knew it in the way children laughed at my patched clothes, in the way teachers' eyes slid past me when I failed to bring lunch. I knew it in the quiet envy that filled me when I watched boys unwrap sandwiches thick with meat. And yet, my mother never let despair turn her cruel. She carried her hunger like a secret, hiding it behind a resilience I would not understand until much later. At night, when she tucked me into bed, she whispered words I have never forgotten. Wealth isn't counted in coins, Arthur. It's counted in the mouths you feed. Remember that, no matter what you become. At the time, I didn't know what she meant. To me, wealth was exactly coins, stacks of them. Enough to buy bread and milk without watching the shopkeeper weigh every ounce as if judging our worth. Wealth was freedom from hunger's grip. Yet those words lingered, stitched into the fabric of my mind. When I was 14, my mother fell ill. The sickness came quietly at first, a cough here, a day of weakness there. But soon it grew into something relentless, stealing her strength, piece by piece. The doctor's visits cost more than we could spare, and the medicines he prescribed were luxuries we could not afford. I remember watching her shoulders shrink, her hands tremble as she still tried to sew, to mend, to clean. She fought to keep me in school, though more often than not, I skipped classes to work odd jobs carrying crates, sweeping shops, anything that would bring home a few more coins. The night she died, I sat by her side, clutching her hand as though my grip alone might anchor her to this world. Her last words to me were faint, almost lost in the rattle of her breath. Feed others. Arthur, never forget. And then she was gone. I buried her in a graveyard where the earth smelled of rain and old flowers. The headstone was simple, marked only with her name and the year she lived. No great legacy, no riches, no recognition. And yet, to me, she was the richest soul I had ever known, for she had given everything she had not to herself, but to me. After that, hunger became my enemy and my fuel. I swore I would never again let it dictate my life. I worked, clawed, scraped. I bargained with men who sneered at my ragged clothes, endured insults I swallowed like bitter medicine. Slowly, step by step, I climbed. At first it was coins, then pounds, then the kind of money that turned heads. I learned the language of numbers, of risk, of deals struck in smoke-filled rooms. I built something out of nothing, piece by piece, until I could walk into any restaurant in the city and order the finest dish without glancing at the price. And yet, I discovered that wealth does not silence the echoes of the past. I could pile gold on my table, drape myself in suits tailored from the world's finest fabrics, and still, late at night, I would hear my mother's words. Still, I would remember that pot of potatoes boiling in water, the taste of broth so thin it might as well have been tears. What no one told me was that success comes with its own kind of hunger, a hollowness that no feast can fill. My name was known in boardrooms, my signature carried weight. But when I returned home at night, to mansions lined with marble and paintings, I found myself alone. Alone with silence, alone with memories, alone with a hunger that gnawed not at my stomach but at my soul. It was in those moments that I would think of her, my mother, her voice soft and steady. Wealth isn't counted in coins but in the mouths you feed. I had fed myself, yes, but had I fed anyone else? Or had I built walls so high that no one could reach me? I convinced myself I had left hunger behind, that it was a ghost belonging only to my childhood. But that illusion shattered the night I heard her voice, the little girl in the restaurant, her words trembling through the air. Can I clean? For leftover food. The first real money I made was not the kind that earns applause. It came from hustling in corners where men shook hands in shadows, from bargains struck with those who valued survival over law. I was no saint. I was desperate. Every coin I earned was another nail driven into the coffin of poverty, and I swung that hammer without remorse. But over time I learned to polish the edges, to clothe my hunger in respectability. I learned how to read contracts, how to predict markets, how to speak the language of ambition in a way That opened doors no ragged boy could ever have dreamed of entering. Can still remember the first night I wore a suit tailored to fit me. Not one bought secondhand from a stall. It was navy blue, cut sharp at the shoulders, its fabric whispering wealth even before I had any true wealth to boast of. I stood before a mirror in a rented room, tracing the lines of myself as though seeing a stranger. For a moment, I felt powerful, invincible. And yet when I looked closer, I could still see the boy with empty pockets staring back. Hunger does not leave you so easily. As years passed, the numbers grew. The flats became apartments, the apartments became houses, the houses became estates. My table no longer held one cracked bowl of soup, but feasts laid out for guests who praised my generosity. I shook hands with politicians, sealed deals with bankers, and built an empire brick by brick. If you asked the world, they would say I had won, that Arthur had conquered his past. That hunger was nothing but a shadow buried under piles of gold. But the truth is, wealth is a peculiar thing. It hides the scars but never heals them. I would sit at those long mahogany tables, listening to the laughter of men whose stomachs had never known emptiness, and I would feel a strangeness settle over me. Their words rolled with ease, their jokes carried no weight. And I, though dressed in silk, felt like an impostor among them. Because I knew what it was to ache for bread, and I knew they did not. The meals themselves mocked me. Silver trays heavy with meat, crystal bowls brimming with sauces, desserts stacked high with sugar that melted on the tongue. Yet no matter how much I ate, I never felt full. My hunger had changed shape. It was no longer for food, it was for meaning, for something beyond the numbers that padded my accounts. And when the laughter faded, when the guests left, when silence crept back into my mansion, I would hear her voice again. My mother's whisper, "Wealth isn't counted in coins, but in the mouths you feed." I told myself I was feeding mouths, employees, shareholders, partners. But when I looked closely, I saw only men like me, chasing numbers, each of us clutching at wealth as if it might drown out the hollowness inside. No child was fed because of me, no life was lifted. My empire was a monument to myself, nothing more. There were nights when I would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, dreaming of those lean years. I would see myself as a boy, standing by a bakery window, watching loaves of bread that I could not afford, the smell tormenting me. In those dreams, I would push open the door, but each time, the bread would crumble to dust in my hands. I would wake with the taste of ash in my mouth, my chest tight with a hunger I could not name. It was during one of those nights that I realized something terrible. I had built my life to escape hunger, and yet hunger had followed me here, wearing a new mask. It was not in my stomach, it was in my soul. I had succeeded, yes, but success had left me hollow. I think this is why her voice pierced me so deeply that night in the restaurant. When Maya spoke, I heard not just her, but the echo of my own childhood. Her words carried me back to that pot of gray potatoes, to my mother's trembling hands, to the cold of nights spent shivering under thin blankets. She was me, only smaller, frailer, and standing in a world far less forgiving than the one I had known, and yet it was not just hunger I saw in her. There was something else, something darker. Her eyes carried a secret, a weight too heavy for someone her age. A weight I recognized, though I could not yet name it. I had carried my own weights once: grief, abandonment, shame, and I knew how they carved themselves into the soul. To see them in a child's eyes was unbearable. That night, when the waiter dragged her away, I tried to bury the moment. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was seeing ghosts of my own past, that she was just another beggar child, one of thousands who drifted through the alleys of the city. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. She was not just any child. She was the mirror of my beginnings, the living reminder of everything I had tried to forget. And perhaps that is why I could not let it go. For weeks after, I found myself wandering streets I had long avoided. I drove through alleys where I once scrounged for work, past markets where children still pressed their noses against glass displays of food. I looked for her, though I never admitted it aloud. I told myself I was checking on my city, surveying the lives of those less fortunate. But the truth was simpler. I was hunting for a voice. For her. Each time I did not find her, the guilt grew heavier. My mother's words returned to me in full force. It's counted in the mouths you feed. I had fed no one. And in failing her that night, I had broken a promise I did not even realize I was still carrying. I thought wealth had freed me from hunger, but now, every night I heard it whisper again. Hunger had never left. It had simply been waiting for the moment I would see it, staring back at me through a child's eyes. The restaurant was awash with laughter that night, the kind that swells from men too sure of themselves, men who had long forgotten the taste of hunger. Crystal glasses caught the golden glow of chandeliers. Polished silverware chimed against porcelain plates, and the scent of roasted duck drifted through the air. I sat among them, half listening, my thoughts already drifting, when I heard it. A sound so small, it cut through the noise like a thread pulled taut against velvet. Can I clean for leftover food? At first, I thought I had imagined it, some echo from the past that had slipped into the present. But then the room quieted. Not fully, but just enough for eyes to glance toward the source. She was there, standing near the edge of our table, her frame dwarfed by the grand doors behind her. She could not have been more than 9 or 10, thin, almost breakable. Her dress was faded and uneven at the hem, her shoes worn down to the soles. Her hair, tied back in a clumsy knot, had begun to fall loose, strands curling against her cheeks. She kept her head slightly lowered, as though bracing for rejection, yet her voice had carried, trembling but steady, into a room that did not welcome her. The guests exchanged looks. One man chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as though this intrusion were a sort of entertainment. Another leaned back in his chair, muttering, "Unbelievable. Where's the staff?" A woman in pearls whispered to her companion, her lips curling with distaste. Already, the waiter nearest her was moving, his polished shoes clicking across the floor, his hand outstretched to usher her away. I should have let the moment pass. That's what was expected of me, but something in her eyes stopped me cold. They were not pleading eyes. They were too proud for that, too fierce. Yes, desperation lived there raw, undeniable, but it was tethered to a stubborn pride that refused to collapse, even under the weight of hunger. She was not begging for charity. She was offering her hands, her dignity. The waiter bent toward her, his voice sharp but low, as though ashamed to be overheard. "You can't be here. Out now." She flinched but did not move. Her hands, small and calloused, clenched into fists at her sides. She repeated, softer this time, but no less firm, "I can clean. Please, just for food." A few guests laughed. Outright now. One called for more wine, as if the girl's intrusion had been nothing more than a momentary distraction. But I felt the air shift in my lungs, heavy, suffocating. It was my mother's voice that rose in me then, unbidden. "Wealth isn't counted in coins, Arthur, but in the mouths you feed." Before I could think, I spoke. "Wait." The word carried further than I intended, silencing those nearest me. The waiter froze, turning toward me with a puzzled expression. The girl's eyes flicked up, meeting mine for the first time. And in that instant, I was undone. They were eyes carved from struggle, too old for her young face. Eyes that had seen hunger not as a passing misfortune, but as a daily companion. Yet within them burned a question that pierced me. Would I too turn her away? "Bring her here," I said. My voice was steady, though inside, my chest tightened. The waiter hesitated. "Sir, I said, "Bring her here." Reluctantly, he stepped aside. She approached slowly, each step careful, as though the polished floor might reject her presence. The guests shifted in their chairs, murmurs rising. I ignored them. My focus was only on her. "What's your name?" I asked. She did not answer. At once, her lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders tense, as if even her name was something that could be stolen. Finally she whispered, "Maya." Maya, a name as fragile as the girl herself, and yet it lingered in the air with unexpected weight. I gestured to the empty chair beside me. She shook her head quickly, her chin lifting with that same pride. "I don't need to sit. I can clean." Her words sank into me. She was starving, yet still clinging to dignity, refusing to take what she had not earned. Something in me broke then, a crack running through the armor I had built over years of wealth. The murmurs around. US grew louder. "This is absurd," someone muttered. Another scoffed. "Children like that should be kept outside." But I barely heard them. I pushed my plate toward her, the meat half finished, the bread basket still warm. "Eat," I said. Her eyes widened. For a heartbeat, pride and desperation warred inside her. Then, slowly, she reached for the bread, her small hands trembling as she tore off a piece. She ate quickly, as though afraid the food might vanish. The sight hollowed me out. "Where are your parents?" I asked quietly. Her chewing slowed. She did not look at me. She swallowed, then shook her head. "Not here. Someone must be waiting for you." She glanced toward the door, her expression tightening. I should go. And just like that, she pulled away, retreating into herself. Before I could press further, she stood, clutching the crust of bread in her hand. Her gaze darted across the room, wary of the stares now fixed on her. Then, without another word, she turned and slipped toward the doors. The waiter moved to block her, but I raised a hand. "Let her go." And so she vanished into the night, swallowed by the city's shadows. I sat there in silence, the laughter of the guests returning in uneven waves, though now tinged with unease. They poured their wine, raised their voices, eager to drown out the moment, but I could not. Her eyes followed me, haunting me. Her voice lingered. "I can clean. Just for food." Who was she? And why was she out here alone? When the dinner ended and I stepped into the cold night air, I caught a glimpse of her further down the street, her small figure darting between lamplight and shadow, the bread still clutched in her hand. My pulse quickened. Against every instinct, against every voice of reason, I began to follow her. Discreetly, step by step, I walked into the night after Maya. The night air was sharp, carrying the kind of cold that crept into the bones and made even the proudest shoulders hunch. Maya walked quickly, bread clutched to her chest as though it were treasure. I kept my distance, my polished shoes whispering against cobblestones slick with frost. The streets she took were not the ones I knew. They curved away from the grand avenues of my world, away from the laughter of well-lit cafes and into darker veins of the city. Here the lamps flickered weakly, their light swallowed by alleys heavy with smoke. The smell shifted too, from roasted meats and perfume to damp brick, rotting wood, and refuse piled in corners no one bothered to sweep. Maya did not look back. Her steps were quick, almost too quick for her small frame. At times she clutched the bread tighter, glancing toward doorways as if she feared someone might snatch it away. My chest tightened as I followed, each corner taking us further from the safe, civilized mask of the city and deeper into its neglected heart. Finally she stopped. A house loomed ahead, not really a house, more a husk. Its walls sagged inward, roof patched with tarps that flapped weakly in the wind. Windows were cracked or boarded, save for one where light leaked through in uneven stripes. The door hung on its hinges, crooked, scarred with boot marks. She slipped inside, pushing against the wood with practiced care so it would not creak. I hesitated across the street, the shadows of an abandoned shop cloaking me. Through one of The broken windows I could see inside. The first thing I noticed was not the girl, but the man. He was sprawled in a chair near the hearth, though no fire warmed it. A bottle hung from his hand, sloshing amber liquid across his shirt. His head jerked up as Maya entered, and even from where I stood I could see the change in his face. The narrowing of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. "Where have you been?" His voice cracked through the room, loud and jagged, making her flinch. She stepped carefully, clutching the bread behind her back. I was helping. Helping? Who? He shoved himself upright, the bottle clattering against the floor. "You sneaking again? Think you're clever, do you?" "No, sir," she whispered. Her voice was steady but small, the same way she had spoken in the restaurant. Not pleading, controlled. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. She gasped but did not cry out. Even from a distance I could see the red mark blooming where his fingers pressed. "Don't you lie to me, girl. I'll know." She shook her head quickly, words tumbling out. "I just wanted bread, that's all. Just bread." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then he laughed an ugly sound, guttural and sharp. He snatched the bread from her hands, tore into it with his teeth, crumbs spilling across his beard. He ate like a man determined to ruin the thing she valued most. When he finally dropped what remained on the table, she moved to gather it quietly. "Don't think you're worth feedin'," he muttered, stumbling back toward the chair. "You are nothing. You're nothing." She did not answer. She simply began to clean, sweeping the crumbs together, picking up the bottle he had dropped, folding rags into neat stacks. Her shoulders hunched, but her movements were careful, efficient, practiced. This was not the first night she had done this. Through that cracked window, I felt my own chest burn. I had faced boardrooms, rivals, men in silk ties who bared their teeth with polished smiles. I had stood before men who wanted me ruined, stripped of everything I built. But none of them were as monstrous as what hid behind that crooked door. I should have walked away. That was the logical choice. What right did I have to interfere? What place did I, with my suits and my wealth, have in this ruin of a house? But as I watched her lift a bucket too heavy for her small frame, scrubbing at floors while insults rained down, I knew walking away was no longer possible. My wealth had built me walls of safety, yes, but conscience had pried open a door I could not close. She turned slightly then, and I saw the faint outline of a bruise darkening her cheek, half hidden beneath her hair. It wasn't fresh. It had been there for days. My fists clenched in the cold. I wanted to storm across the street, tear the door from its hinges, and drag her out, but something held me back. Fear, perhaps not for myself, but for her. A rash move might only worsen her punishment. So I stayed in the shadows, heart pounding, with fury and shame, watching as she carried on. Watching as she wiped tables, folded torn blankets, stacked broken dishes like precious china. And through it all, she never complained, never begged. Her silence was a rebellion of its own, a quiet refusal to give him the satisfaction of tears. The pieces fell into place too neatly to be coincidence. When Clara died, Thomas stepped in, claiming guardianship. And from that moment, Maya vanished from the record, her world shrinking to the walls of that broken home. But there was more. I knew there had to be. Records tell one story, but neighbors tell another. So I went there myself, dressed in the plainest coat I owned, a scarf pulled high, my polished shoes dulled with dust. I walked the street slowly, letting my eyes drift across cracked porches and sagging rooftops. The kind of details wealth has a way of erasing from memory. The neighbors did not speak easily. Men leaned against doorframes, arms crossed, watching me with suspicion. Women hurried children inside, their voices hushed. But suspicion bends under persistence. And persistence is a skill I've sharpened all my life. One woman, her apron dusted with flour, finally spoke as I lingered near her gate. "You looking for trouble?" "No," I answered quietly. "I'm looking for the truth." Her eyes softened at that, but only a fraction. "If it's the heart girl you're asking about, best leave it be." "Why?" "Because Thomas don't like questions. And folk round here learned long ago that when he don't like something, everyone pays the price." Her words hung in the air like frost. She said no more, but her silence was heavy, loaded with things she dared not give voice to. I thanked her and moved on, but inside me the fire burned hotter. Later that evening, I pieced together what little I had. A dead mother. A girl withdrawn from school. A guardian who drank his nights away and barked cruelty like second nature. And in between, the image of Maya herself, her hands clutching bread as though it were life itself, her eyes burning with both desperation and defiance. I thought I understood then. But the truth was still hiding, waiting. And I would not rest until I uncovered it. The neighborhood around Thomas's house was a place that carried silence like a wound. Streets where laughter was scarce, where doors closed quickly at the sight of strangers, where children learned early that shadows had teeth. I walked those streets more than once in the following days, never drawing attention, always listening. And the more I listened, the more I began to hear the cracks in the silence. It was never direct. People rarely spoke Thomas's name aloud. Instead, they let it fall between sentences, dropped like a weight. The man in the cooked house, the drunk, the one who keeps the girl. Words spoken in half whispers, fragments tossed into the air and quickly snatched back, as though even saying too much might summon him. One evening, as dusk bled across the rooftops, I lingered near an old man sitting on his stoop, his pipe glowing faintly in the dark. He studied me for a long time before speaking. "You don't belong here." "No," I admitted. "But the girl does, Maya." His pipe paused midair, eyes narrowing. He let out a slow stream of smoke. "You'd best forget her. That man keeps her close, too close. And folk round here don't interfere. We learned better." "Better?" I pressed. The old man shifted, his voice low. "She's not allowed friends, not allowed school no more. He keeps her in line the way a farmer keeps livestock. Feed just enough to keep her breathing, starve her when she steps out of place. It's all control. He's a cruel one, and the cruel know how to keep their grip." His words settled into me like poison. I thanked him, though my voice was tight, and walked away with fists clenched in my coat pockets. Every detail matched what I had seen through that cracked window. Maya scrubbing floors, her body bruised, her silence louder than screams. But now it had a shape. Food was not just hunger, it was a weapon. Safety was not just absent, it was withheld. Over the next week, I confirmed it again and again. Different neighbors, same story, though told in guarded fragments. Maya's world was one of chores and punishments, of locked doors and whispered threats. Some said they had seen her sneaking out at night, returning with scraps she scavenged, only to face Thomas's rage when he discovered her absence. Others swore they had heard shouting through the walls, bottles shattering, her cries muffled before they could carry far. The whispers painted him as something more than a drunk. He was a man who enjoyed the power of fear, who savored the way a child flinched at his footsteps. And though no one could prove it, every neighbor carried the same unease in their eyes, the sense that behind those crooked walls, horrors brewed, that no one dared put into words. I walked away from each conversation with my thoughts heavier. Wealth had trained me to recognize patterns, to see where threads connect. And here, the pattern was clear. Thomas's cruelty was not careless. It was deliberate. He rationed her food not because he lacked it, but because it gave him control. He denied her school not because of poverty, but because knowledge breeds independence. Every choice he made tightened the leash around her neck. And Maya bore it all in silence. The girl who had stood in a room full of wealthy strangers and offered to clean for scraps was the same girl who endured insults and blows. Without collapsing, her silence was not weakness. It was armor. But even armor cracks with time. One night, unable to stand it, I returned to that broken house. I lingered again in the shadows across the street, the cold biting at my fingers. Through the window, I saw her moving about with that same quiet efficiency, washing rags, sweeping dust, fetching bottles Thomas had dropped. He barked at her once, sharp enough to make her flinch, but she carried on. And then it happened. She passed by the window, her face turning ever so slightly, and for a fleeting moment, her eyes caught mine. Not fully, not enough to know who I was, perhaps, but enough to feel me. And in that split second, her expression shifted, not surprise, not fear, something else, something like recognition. I stepped back into the shadows, heart racing. Had she seen me before, standing here? Did she know I had been watching? And if so, what did she think? That I was another threat? Or worse, that I was another who would watch and do nothing? I left that night shaken, my resolve hardened. I could not remain a shadow any longer. If I wanted to know the truth, I would have to earn it from her, piece by fragile piece, because the neighbors had shown me enough to understand. One thing, her hunger was not the greatest pain she carried. No, the worst of it was locked behind her silence. And I feared what it might reveal when it finally broke. First time she spoke to me, truly spoke, it was not in the grand halls of power or the safety of daylight. It was in the brittle silence of a street corner, the moonlight falling weakly through a cracked lamppost. She stood there with a basket, too large for her arms, filled only with scraps of stale bread and a bruised apple. I had waited for her, timed my steps so that our paths would cross. Though I told myself it was chance, when she saw me, her body stiffened. Flight flickered in her eyes, the instinct of someone accustomed to danger. But I did not move closer. I simply inclined my head, my voice low and steady. "You're Maya." Her grip tightened on the basket, but she did not deny it. "I saw you at the restaurant," I continued. "The night you asked for food." Her eyes darted down the street, toward the house she dreaded returning to. Then, almost too softly to hear, she said, "You shouldn't be here." It was not fear for herself that laced her words. It was warning, as though she knew what Thomas would do if he discovered anyone near her. "I know," I admitted. "But I couldn't forget you." Her lips parted, as though to reply, but no words came. Silence filled the space between us, heavy, layered. Finally, she shifted the basket to one arm and reached into her pocket. From it she drew a ragged scrap of paper, lined, torn from some old school notebook. She held it out without meeting my gaze. I took it carefully. Written in shaky letters was a single word. "Clara, your mother," I said. Her eyes flickered to mine then, wide with something raw. She nodded once, quickly, then turned as though the moment had cost her everything. "Maya," I pressed gently. "What happened to her?" But she shook her head, clutching her basket close, and whispered, "Not now." And just like that, she walked away, leaving me with the scrap of paper and more questions than answers. That was how it began. Not with confession, but with fragments. A name here, a glance there. Sometimes she would pass me notes, scratched hastily on scraps. "School, gone, don't tell." Other times, she said nothing at all, only looking at me with eyes that seemed to beg for understanding while refusing to offer detail. I learned to read her silences as much as her words. When I asked about her stepfather, her jaw would tighten, her hands knotting into fists. When I asked about food, she would glance down at her thin arms, then quickly look away. And when I mentioned her mother, her face went still, a mask pulled tight over something too painful to show. Each fragment built a picture, though incomplete. Clara gone, perhaps too soon. School ended abruptly, not by her choice. Hunger not mere circumstance, but punishment. And Thomas the unspoken shadow at the center of it all, a name she never said but one that shaped every silence. There were nights when she would linger a little longer, allowing me to walk a short distance with her. She never let me too close to the house, always stopping short, always urging me to turn back. But in those walks, she would let slip pieces of truth in a voice barely above a whisper. He locks the bread away. He counts what's left. He says I don't need friends. He says no one cares. Each sentence struck like a blade, not because of the cruelty itself, but because of the calm with which she delivered it. She was not exaggerating, not dramatizing. She was simply stating the facts of her captivity, as one might recite the rules of a game they never agreed to play. And yet, for all that she revealed, I knew she was holding back. There were shadows in her eyes that her words never touched. Shadows that grew heavier each time I pressed too hard. Once, when I asked if he ever laid a hand on her, she froze completely. Her breath caught, her face turned away, and she whispered, "Don't ask that." Then she left me standing alone. In the dark dot, it was then I realized her hunger was not her greatest wound. Hunger she could endure. Hunger she had learned to fight by scavenging scraps and swallowing pride. No, the deeper pain was something she would not, or could not, speak. And her silence on that terrified me more than any confession could dot in. The days that followed, I wrestled with questions I could not answer. Was I helping her by listening? Or was I merely giving her false hope, standing on the edges of her suffering while doing nothing to end it? My wealth gave me the power to intervene, yet every attempt risked exposing her to greater punishment. To act too soon might shatter the fragile trust she had begun to place in me. And so I waited, gathering fragments, each one carving a deeper hollow in my chest. Her story was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and the more I fit together, the clearer it became that the missing ones hid something darker than I dared imagine. Her silences screamed louder than her words, and I began to fear that when she finally broke them, the truth would be worse than anything I had prepared myself for. I began to doubt my own mind. The fragments she gave me were so few, so scattered, that I started filling the spaces between them with my own memories, my own fears. Hunger had taught me to imagine, and now my imagination became a curse. Each silence of hers stretched into 100 possibilities. Was she bruised because of a bottle thrown in anger, or something worse? Did her stepfather ration food to break her spirit, or to prepare her for a fate I dared not speak aloud? At night I lay awake, hearing her voice in the dark words she had never actually spoken, but that my mind invented in the gaps. I saw her mother's death certificate in my thoughts, the single word illness scrawled without detail. What if it wasn't illness at all? What if Thomas had had a hand in it? The question ate at me like rot. And yet, I could not prove anything. All I had were whispers and shadows. There were days when I convinced myself I was imagining monsters, where only misery lived. That perhaps Thomas was just a cruel drunk, not a demon. That Maya's silence was not protection, but shame, the kind children sometimes carry, even when they've done nothing wrong. But then I would see her eyes again, and I knew her silence was not emptiness, it was terror wrapped in skin. One evening, as I lingered too long near the corner of her street, she came to me. She stepped out of the house like a shadow slipping through cracks, clutching a small cloth bundle. She pressed it into my hands before I could even speak. Inside were 2 coins, worn smooth by years of use. "He gave me these," she whispered, eyes darting toward the door. "Said I should keep them safe, said I'll need them soon." Her voice trembled at the edges, and for the first time, I heard something close to fear break through her practiced calm. "What for?" I asked. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "I don't know. I don't ask." But she did know. Her silence told me that much. She knew and could not bring herself to speak it. I wanted to shake the truth from her, to demand it, to promise her safety if only she would confide in me. But I had seen how fragile her trust was, how quickly it vanished if pressed too hard. So I said nothing. I only closed the bundle back into her hands and whispered, "You're not alone, Maya. Not anymore." Her lips trembled as though she wanted to believe me, but her eyes betrayed doubt. She slipped back inside, leaving me on the street with a heart beating far too fast. The days that followed blurred. I found myself consumed by her story, scouring every corner of her past. I returned to the schoolhouse records, pressing for any detail overlooked. A teacher, long retired, finally agreed to meet me. Her face was lined with years, but her memory was sharp. "Maya Hart?" she murmured, her voice soft. "Yes, quiet girl. Smart, always the last to eat at lunch." She never complained, never raised her hand to ask for help. But sometimes, the teacher's eyes clouded. Sometimes I saw her flinch when another child raised their voice, as if she already knew what came after noise. And when she left school, I asked. The teacher's mouth pressed thin. Her mother had just died. A man came, Thomas. He said he was her guardian, signed the papers, took her away. She never came back. Did anyone check on her? No, the teacher admitted, voice breaking slightly. No one did. There are too many like her, too many to chase. And now, she's one more ghost the system forgot. Her words stayed with me long after. Maya had been erased from the world's concern the moment she left those school doors. Forgotten, as though her existence mattered only so long as it could be filed in a ledger. And Thomas had used that invisibility as his weapon. By then, my thoughts were no longer just suspicions. They were convictions. I knew Thomas was not simply cruel. He was planning something. The coins, the silences, the way Maya's eyes darkened when I pressed too far, it all pointed to a truth darker than the bruises on her arms. And then I learned it. The truth. It did not come from her lips, nor from the whispers of neighbors. It came from a man I knew, one of those street corner informants who traded in secrets for coin. He had seen Thomas speaking with strangers, men who did not belong in that neighborhood, men who had no reason to linger unless for business. And the business they dealt in was the kind that turned my blood to ice. He leaned close when he told me, his voice low. "The man's in debt, deep. He's looking for ways to pay it off. Word is, he's planning to sell something. Or someone." I remember the way the world seemed to tilt around me, the way the cobblestones beneath my feet suddenly felt unstable. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together all at once, sharper and crueler than I had imagined. Maya. It was her. And in that moment, I understood what the silence had been hiding. She had never told me because she knew that once the truth was spoken, it became real. She was clinging to fragments of childhood, fragments of dignity. Even as the clock ticked down, I stood there in the dark, every breath heavy, my heart pounding with rage and terror. For the first time in years, I felt powerless. My wealth, my influence, my success, none of it mattered. Because the truth was no longer a question. It was a countdown. And then I learned the truth about what Thomas planned for her. That's when time ran out. The storm broke across the city like a beast unleashed. Rain hammered rooftops, wind rattled shutters, and lightning tore the night sky into jagged white fragments. I remember the sound of it, the fury of nature itself, as though the heavens had decided they could no longer remain silent either. My car cut through the rain-slick streets, its headlights carving narrow paths of light. And at the end of that road waited the crooked house, darker than all the rest. I had heard enough whispers, pieced together enough fragments, to know time was running out. The truth about Thomas's plan had left me sleepless for nights, every tick of the clock another reminder that Maya's childhood was being counted down like coins. I could not wait for daylight, could not wait for officials or courts or papers. That storm was the signal. It was now, or it was never. When I stepped out of the car, The rain lashed against me with such force it felt like punishment. My coat clung heavy to my shoulders as I crossed the street. The crooked house loomed before me, its windows flickering with weak light. And then through the storm's roar, I heard it. A cry, Maya's voice. Thin, breaking, filled with terror. It froze me in place for half a heartbeat, the sound cutting deeper than any blade. Then I was moving, faster than I thought my body capable, my shoes splashing through puddles as I reached the door. It resisted my first shove, the swollen wood groaning against its hinges, but another strike sent it crashing open. The scene inside was lit in fragments, flashes of lightning through cracked glass, the glow of a single lamp struggling against the dark. Maya was on the floor, arms raised to shield herself, her face streaked with tears. Towering over her was Thomas, his form swollen with drink and rage, his hand raised high, ready to strike again. Enough! The word tore from me before I even realized I had spoken. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that filled the room. Thomas turned, his face twisted, eyes bloodshot. For a moment he seemed confused, as though unable to believe anyone had dared enter his domain. Then he sneered, a laugh bubbling from his throat. Well, the gentleman himself. Come to save the poor little rat, have you? I stepped forward, every muscle trembling, though not from fear. From fury, from the years of silence I had carried, from the echoes of my mother's words, from the weight of a promise I had never meant to make, but had made all the same. She's not yours, I said, voice steady. Not anymore. His laugh grew harsher. Not mine? Who feeds her? Who keeps her under a roof, eh? She owes me. She stays because I say so. Maya whimpered, curling further into herself, and the sound nearly broke me. I forced my voice to cut through the storm outside, through the poison inside. You don't feed her. You starve her. You don't protect her. You use her. She owes you nothing. You're nothing. Lightning flashed, painting his face in sharp relief, the sagging cheeks, the unkempt beard, the madness burning behind his eyes. He dropped the bottle in his hand, glass shattering against the floor, and stepped closer, his breath reeking of alcohol. You think money makes you a savior? You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine? I did not move back. My legs threatened to, but I locked them in place. She's not a thing to take. She's a child, and tonight it ends. For a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. Rain hammered the roof, thunder cracked, but inside only silence stretched. Between us, he was waiting for me to break, to flinch, to prove that I was nothing more than another man too afraid to stand against him. But I held his gaze, even as my heart pounded against my ribs. Then his lips curled, and his voice dropped low. You've made a mistake. He lunged with the clumsy force of a man who thought rage was strength. His hands calloused and reeking of drink shot from my collar, but I twisted aside, his weight crashing into the edge of the table. Bottles shattered, liquid spilling across the floor. Maya screamed a sound that sliced through the storm outside and froze my blood. In its tracks, I had never been a fighter. My battles had always been fought in boardrooms, across contracts and signatures, with words sharper than knives. But this was different. This was raw, physical, immediate. Thomas swung again, a fist cutting through the air. It clipped my jaw, the crack of it ringing in my skull. Pain flared white-hot, but I stayed upright. I would not fall. Maya behind me, I gasped, forcing my body between her and the monster before us. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the torn hem of her dress, pressing herself against the wall. Thomas snarled, wiping spit from his beard. You don't belong here, rich man. You don't know how we survive. You call this survival? I spat back, my voice trembling but unyielding. Breaking a child, starving her? That isn't survival, it's cowardice. His roar drowned out the thunder. He lunged again, this time with both arms, slamming me into the wall so hard the plaster cracked. For a moment the world swam, my breath crushed from my chest. His hand went to my throat, squeezing. The smell of whiskey and sweat filled my nose. I clawed at his grip, vision darkening. When lightning flashed through the window and illuminated Maya's face, her eyes wide with terror, her small fists clenched as though she wanted to fight but could not. That sight gave me strength. With a surge I didn't know I had, I slammed my elbow into his ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to shove him back. He stumbled over the broken glass, cursing, blood streaking his hand where shards cut deep. "Stay down." I growled, though my voice shook. "This ends now," but Thomas did not stay down. He rose again, slower this time, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a hatred that seemed older than both of us. He picked up a shard of glass, holding it like a weapon. "You'll bleed." "Before I lose her," he hissed. I felt my heart hammer, my hands trembling. I could hear my own breath louder than the storm, louder than the thunder, louder even than Maya's muffled sobs. For a moment, I wondered if this would be my end. If my story would close not in boardrooms or quiet halls of wealth, but here. In a broken house with rain pouring through the ceiling. Then came the sound. Sirens. Distant at first, then growing louder, cutting through the storm like a blade. Blue and red lights flickered across the wet street outside, reflecting off shattered glass. Thomas froze, his hand tightening around the shard. I had called them. Days before, when the truth first formed on my tongue, I had pulled strings quietly, discreetly. A favor owed here, an official persuaded there. Tonight they had come, not fast enough to stop what I had already seen, but just in time to keep it from going further. The door burst open, rain spilling in with the officers who stormed inside. Shouts filled the room. "Drop it now!" Echoing against the cracked walls. Thomas spun toward them, his face contorted, his voice a snarl. But the shard clattered from his fingers when the first officer raised his weapon. In seconds, they had him on the ground, his arms twisted behind his back, his curses filling the air as they dragged him up. Maya clung to the wall, her eyes darting between me and the men in uniform. She trembled, her lips parted as if she could not believe what she was seeing. "It's over," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. My body shook, my jaw throbbed, my throat ached where his hands had pressed. I reached out to Maya, slowly, gently, as though she were made of glass. "You're safe now." Her small hand slipped into mine, tentative at first, then firmer. She pressed herself against me, her shoulders shaking with sobs she had held back for too long. I wrapped my arm around her, shielding her as Thomas's shouts faded into the storm outside. The officers nodded at me, one of them murmuring, "We'll take it from here." I nodded back, though my legs felt weak beneath me. I watched as Thomas was shoved into the rain, his face twisted with rage, his voice spitting venom even as the cuffs bound him. And yet, as the storm raged on and the Crook house stood silent behind us, I did not feel triumph. Not even relief. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, because deep down, I knew the system was fickle. I had seen men like Thomas slip through cracks wider than any prison bars. He might be gone tonight, but tomorrow, next week? Courts and papers and loopholes had a way of turning monsters loose again, and if that happened, Maya would be no safer than before. As I held her close, listening to her ragged breaths against my chest, one thought burned through me like fire. The system might fail her. Unless I stepped forward. The house was quiet in those first days. My world had always been filled with noise meetings, contracts, the clinking of cutlery at long tables, the idle chatter of people too proud to hear themselves. But after Maya came into my care, silence took on a new shape. It was no longer the silence of empty rooms, but the silence of someone learning to breathe again. She moved through my home like a ghost at first, her footsteps light, her presence barely felt. She did not touch the food laid out for her unless I urged her. She hid pieces of bread in her pockets, as though certain they might vanish if left on the plate. More than once, I found crumbs tucked into the drawers of her room, a small insurance against hunger's return. At night, I would pass her door and hear her stir, restless, as if waiting for the footsteps of a man who no longer existed in her world, but still haunted her dreams. Sometimes she would cry quietly, the sound muffled by blankets, but she never came to me, never asked for comfort. Pride still ruled her heart, that same pride I had seen in her eyes the night she stood in the restaurant and offered to clean. For food, I gave her space. I remembered my own childhood, the way hunger had made me flinch at kindness because kindness so often proved fleeting. I knew trust could not be demanded. It had to grow slowly, like a fragile plant in poor soil. The first time she spoke more than a single word to me was one evening at the dinner table. I had prepared a meal myself, not with chefs or servants, but with my own hands, clumsy as they were. Bread, soup, roasted chicken. She sat across from me, her eyes darting between the food and my face, as if waiting for permission. "You should eat," I said gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "Why?" The word startled me. "Because it's yours." Her brow furrowed. "It won't be taken?" I shook my head. "Never." Something flickered in her eyes then, doubt, hope, fear all tangled together. She ate slowly, watching me as though expecting me to change my mind. When she finished, she pushed her plate away carefully, leaving a small portion untouched. "You can have the rest," she said. I leaned forward. "No, Maya, it's yours, every bit of it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not argue, but neither did she eat more. She excused herself quietly, slipping away into her room. And I sat there long after, staring at the half-empty plate, realizing that for her, food was not nourishment yet. It was memory, it was fear. It would take more than full cupboards to erase that. The days blurred into weeks. She explored the house in silence, never straying too far, never touching things that were not hers. She read books from the library. Shelves, but always returned them exactly as she found them, as though afraid of being accused of theft. She folded her clothes with military precision, kept her room spotless, swept corners no one asked her to sweep. It broke me, watching her live as though my home were another cage. But I knew change would not come with grand gestures. It would come with patience, with consistency, with proof over and over again that she was safe now. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, I found her standing by the fire, staring into the flames. She did not turn when I entered, but her voice carried softly. "Do you believe people can forget hunger?" I thought of my mother, of the pot of gray potatoes, of the nights I went to bed counting coins in my head instead of sheep. "No," I answered honestly, "we never forget. But we can learn to live beyond it." Her shoulders shifted slightly, and for the first time, she let herself lean into my presence. Not much, not enough to call it trust, but just enough to say she was listening. That night, for the first time since she came, she slept without stirring. It began with the smallest things. A sound, a glance, a shift so delicate it might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching her so closely. One afternoon, I walked past the library door and heard it, a faint hum, almost a tune, drifting from between the shelves. Maya stood by the window, a book in her lap, her lips moving softly to a melody only she seemed to know. The moment she saw me, the sound vanished, her eyes dropping to the floor. But I had heard it. For the first time, her silence had cracked. Another day, in the garden, she bent to touch the roses, tracing the petals with gentle fingers. I approached quietly, afraid to startle her. "Do you like them?" I asked. She nodded once, not meeting my gaze. "My mother had flowers," she whispered, so faint I almost missed it. "Not roses, daisies. She said they were cheerful. She said—" Her voice faltered, then stopped. She pulled her hand away from the petals, as though even that small memory cost her too much, but she had spoken. She had given me a piece of her mother, a memory fragile as glass, and I cherished it. It was these fragments that began to shape her new life. The crumbs of laughter, the sparks of memory, the tiny ways she allowed herself to exist without fear. I noticed she no longer hid food in her pockets. At dinner, she still ate carefully, but she left nothing behind. Once, I caught her slipping a slice of bread into her mouth with a quick, mischievous grin, and for a fleeting second, I saw not the haunted girl from the broken house, but the child she might have been all along. And slowly, the house itself began to change. It no longer echoed with silence. It began to carry the sound of footsteps running down the hall, of pages turning in books left open on the floor, of cups clinking as she poured herself milk without asking permission. These were ordinary sounds, but to me they were symphonies. Each one proof that the cage Thomas had built around her was splintering apart. I had thought I was saving her. That night in the storm, when I dragged her from his shadow, I believed I was the rescuer, the protector, the man who had given her a second chance. But the truth came quietly, in moments I did not expect. It came one evening as I sat at my desk. Papers spread before me, numbers dancing in the glow of the lamp. My life had always been measured in contracts, profits, deals struck and broken. Success was the rhythm of my heart. But as I stared at the papers, I realized I felt nothing. The numbers that once defined me seemed hollow. And then I heard it, a laugh light and quick. From the hallway. Maya. She was laughing. Not loudly, not freely yet, but enough to fill the air with a sound that had been absent for too long. I pushed the papers aside, rising from my chair, and stood there listening, my chest tight. In that moment, I knew the truth. I thought I had saved her, but she was the one saving me. She was pulling me out of the hunger I had carried all my life, not hunger for food, but for meaning. She was teaching me that wealth, true wealth, was not in accounts or estates, but in the sound of laughter returned to a house that had been empty too long. I began to notice the changes in myself. I no longer sought the company of partners or the approval of colleagues. I no longer cared for the polished dinners or the hollow applause. My world had narrowed, but in narrowing, it had deepened. Each morning I rose not to chase profit, but to ensure Maya had breakfast waiting. Each evening I measured my success not in ledgers, but in whether she had smiled that day. It frightened me how much I needed her presence. Frightened me because I knew she had been hurt too deeply to bear the weight of another's dependence. But I also knew this: she was no longer alone. And neither was I. One night, as I tucked a blanket around her where she had fallen asleep in the library chair, her lips moved faintly. "Thank you," she whispered, though her eyes never opened. I stood there a long time, the words echoing through me. I had given her safety, yes, but she had given me something greater, the chance to feel alive again. And so, as the days turned to weeks, I stopped thinking of it as rescue. I began to think of it as survival. Together, the moment I knew she had begun to reclaim herself came on an evening that seemed ordinary at first. The table was set with simple food, bread, soup, fruit laid out in a bowl. I had grown used to her careful silence at meals, to the way she ate with eyes lowered, hands cautious. But that night, as the fire warmed the room and rain pattered softly against the windows, she looked up at me and spoke without hesitation. "Can I pour for you?" Her voice was steady. Not trembling, not fearful, but sure. She reached for the jug of water and filled my glass with a careful hand. Then she smiled, small, fragile, but real. In that instant, the memory of the restaurant struck me like lightning. I heard again the whisper of her voice, thin and breaking. "Can I clean for leftover food?" That was the plea that had shattered my silence, the voice that had pulled me out of my own hollow world. And now, here she was, the same girl, but changed. no longer begging for scraps, no longer bargaining with her dignity. She was offering kindness, not as a transaction, but as a gift. I set my hand over hers, steadying the jug. "Thank you, Maya," I said. My voice cracked with memory. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw not just survival in them, but life. Later that evening, as she cleared the table of her own will, humming softly to herself, I sat by the fire and let the truth settle over me. I had believed I was the one saving her, that without me, she would have been lost. But the truth was more complicated, more humbling. I thought I was saving her. Truth is, she saved me. She saved me from a life defined by numbers and empty victories. She saved me from the silence of rooms too large to fill. She saved me from the hunger that had followed me even into wealth. Her laughter, her small voice, her fragile trust, these had become my wealth, greater than any coin. And yet, even as I basked in that realization, I could not ignore the shadow that still lingered. Thomas was gone, yes, dragged away in cuffs, swallowed by the storm. But the system was fickle, the law easily bent. Papers could be signed, loopholes exploited. Men like him had a way of returning when least expected. I knew then that this was not the end. Saving Maya was not a single act, not one stormy night or one confrontation. It was a lifetime. It was vigilance, patience, love given without condition. It was standing ready to protect her from a world that had already taken too much. And so, I turned my reflection outward. I remember her voice in that restaurant, small enough to be swallowed by laughter, fragile enough to be ignored. I remember the way every guest turned away, eager to return to their silver spoons and wine glasses. I remember how close I came to turning away myself. And I ask you now, as you listen to this story, as you hold its weight in your own chest, when the smallest voice reaches your ear, will you listen? Or will you turn away? Because sometimes salvation does not arrive with trumpets or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper so faint it can barely be heard above the clinking of glasses. A whisper that, if ignored, fades forever. I listened. Not soon enough, not without hesitation, but I listened. And in listening, I found not just her, but myself. And so I leave you with silence, not empty, but heavy. The kind of silence that asks a question only you can answer.